Well, good afternoon, good evening, or maybe indeed good morning, depending where you are in the world. I'm Professor Rodney Smith, and as Interim Head of School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Sydney, I would like very much to welcome you to the University's annual Wheelwright Lecture. University of Sydney is built on the ancestral lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I would like to begin this event by acknowledging the traditional custodians of these lands and pay my respects to elders past and present. And I also extend my respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us today online. This occasion is, of course, the EL, or TED, Wheelwright Annual Memorial Lecture, and this lecture is held to commemorate the contribution of Ted Wheelwright to Australian political economy and to the social sciences more generally. Ted Wheelwright was an inspiring teacher and colleague here at the University of Sydney for more than 30 years, from the 1950s to the 1980s. And on a personal note, it was my good fortune to meet Ted Wheelwright on a number of occasions at the start of my academic career, the first time I was at the University of Sydney. More broadly, of course, his legacy is one of being one of the great contributors to the development of Australian political economy, foundational to that discipline. Ted taught and wrote about globalisation before the term gained currency. He was highly critical of many of its features, such as foreign investment dependence, economic inequality, environmental destruction, the power of transnational corporations, and the undermining of national sovereignty. In 1975, he established a Transnational Corporations Research Project at the University of Sydney, and this project generated extensive research about transnational capitalism as the forces of globalization became increasingly evident. His research interests also encompassed economic history from a labour perspective, consumerism, imperialism, and the concentration of corporate power in Australian industry. Ted made a significant contribution to the establishment and teaching in 1975 of the first courses in political economy at this university. He was also known as a public intellectual, frequently contributing to media debates and providing critical insights on current events. In addition, he actively sought to advance community and labour interests. Ted helped to establish the Australian Consumers Association, the University Cooperative Bookshop, and the local forerunner of our union, the National Tertiary Education Union, which at that time was called the Sydney Association of University Teachers. In 2008, the first year of political economy as a separate department within the School of Social and Political Sciences and the Faculty of Arts, sorry, at that stage we're still in business, the annual Wheelwright Memorial Lecture was introduced. So welcome to this, the 14th annual Wheelwright Lecture. And I'll now ask Associate Professor Lynn Chester, the Chair of the Department of Political Economy, to say a few words. Thank you, Lynn.
Hello, everyone. My name is Lynn Chester. As Rodney mentioned, I am Chair of the Department of Political Economy here at the University of Sydney. It is my pleasure on behalf of the department to introduce our 2021 Wheelwright speaker, Kim Stanley, generally known as Stan Robertson. The title of Stan's address is Dodging a Mass Extinction Event, Climate Change and Necessity. Stan is a public intellectual and an acclaimed award-winning author of radical science fiction. Science fiction writing uses an inherently political genre. The imagining of any future or an alternate history is about how things should be. The struggle of politics is about how things should be. Imagining is a necessary precondition. Science fiction regards the status quo as contingent, an historical episode that can be changed. A common theme through Stan's writings is the imagining of a more sustainable, saner, just society. A credible future that does not require human nature to be revised, reconstructed, or rewired. These credible futures, for better or worse, Give us a means to critically reflect on past trajectories to the present and possible trajectories or paths to the future. Stan's works imagine a more humane, equitable world created by humans through flawed characteristics with conflicts. For example, in his well-known Mars trilogy, Red Mars, Green Mars and Blue Mars, Stan's characters include idealists, drug addicts, survivors of abuse, opportunists, cynics, narcissists, manic depressives and more. These characters speak to Stan's political vision, realistic about us as human beings and our social reality, but optimistic about our capacity to remake society, to remake our social reality. His other works have imagined the role of women to make society's major decisions through communication and settlement amongst themselves, not the use of fiats or decrees. Stan has also set stories in a non-white world. His recent book, The Ministry for the Future, features popular uprisings, student debt strikes, geoengineering, eco-terrorism, war, and commandeering of central banks to finance a just transition from fossil fuels. These are not the more common tropes of science fiction writing. They are, however, deployed by Stan using many eyewitness accounts to tell the story of how climate change will impact everyone. The Ministry for the Future presents the possibility of a world transitioning from capitalism over the next few decades, for millions of lives to be saved from a mass extinction event. Anthropogenic-induced climate change has underpinned much of Stan's oeuvre, as has the role that science and technology may play in a societal transformation. These themes, I'm sure, informed his recent participation at the UN's COP26 Climate Change Conference in Glasgow and will inform his address to us today. Before giving the Zoom floor to Stan, a few words about this event structure. Stan will speak for about 40 minutes. Then Dick Bryan will conduct a short conversational interview with Stan. Dick is an emeritus professor in our Department of Political Economy. He, among others, has been acknowledged in some of Stan's works, such as New York 2140 and the Ministry for the Future. Following this conversation between Stan and Dick, there will be a Q&A between Stan and 4 of our political economy students, Anna, Sam, Leah and Swapnik, who will each ask a question. We will then conclude the event. So now it's an immense pleasure for me to give the Zoom floor to Kim Stanley Robinson for this year's 14th Wheelwright Annual Lecture. Thank you, Stan.
Thank you, Lynn. And thank you, Rodney. I am hoping that you are hearing me, and I believe I'm going to wait briefly until I get confirmation of that shift.
All good, Stan. All good.
All good. Excellent. All right. Thank you very much for that. And I also want to thank immediately my friend Dick Bryan, who has been a big part of my education over the last 10 years in these matters. And also my gratitude that I'm speaking to a Department of Political Economy. These are rare in the world, as I'm sure that you know there. And yet the need for political economy as distinct from economics has never been greater. And indeed it is the technology, if you want to call it that, by which we are going to dodge a mass extinction event. If we do, a new political economy is required to accomplish this. So first I'm going to very briefly pass by the obvious fact that a mass extinction event would be a bad thing, and that we are trembling on the brink of one. The most recent IPCC report that came out in August was, if read in full, a terrifying description of how close we are to disaster. And I would recommend to you Johann Rockstrom's Planetary Boundaries, which is both a book and a Netflix series show that describes those planetary boundaries, as he calls them, that we are close to crashing through and creating a situation that we cannot claw back from, that will result in ecological disaster for the biosphere that will have necessarily devastating effects for human beings. And let me end with this part of it, because I think this is known to all of us now, that extinctions in particular are final and unrecoverable. The so-called de-extinction movement is interesting, and it's even teaching us some useful things, but it is not a program that can be accomplished. 99% of the extinctions that happen to species are unrecoverable and those species will never come back. If in 100 years we have created a mass extinction event, the humans that stagger on past that time, no matter how well they pull themselves together, will never have those species back, and it will be a permanent loss to that will be on us. So it's best to dodge it. But it has to be said immediately that a lot of human beings will be, in effect, fighting for the mass extinction event to happen. They won't conceive it that way, obviously, but the truth is they'll be doing it. Since we are in a Department of Political Economy, let me do what you might call a pseudo quantification, or an English major's quantification of the why I say that. There have been 3,500 gigatons of fossil fuels identified under the ground around the Earth. It's been estimated that we can burn about 500 of them more before we cross the 1.5 C limit, even the 2 C limit that the IPCC has identified as high as we can go without crossing those planetary boundaries. So this means that 3,000 gigatons, that's billions of tons of fossil fuels that we know are there, we cannot burn. I did a literal back of the envelope calculation with the help of my mathematician wife to check my numbers. And taking the current price of barrel of oil as my benchmark, and I have to admit immediately, this is a very notional and hypothetical amount. Nevertheless, I rated that 3,000 gigatons of stranded, need to be stranded fossil fuels as being worth about 1,600 trillion US dollars. Now, the world GDP per year is about $75 trillion. So this is not perhaps as stunning an amount as you might first think when you hear it, but 1.6 quadrillion dollars. But about 75 to 80% of those fossil fuels that need to be stranded are not in private hands. They're not owned by Exxon and Royal Dutch Shell and the other fossil fuel companies that are out there. They are owned by companies run by their governments. They are national assets. And these countries, not all countries have fossil fuel assets in those kind of huge amounts, but some do. They're called the petrostates, and they rely on it for their financial balance books to balance out. Some of them generate most of their income by the sale of their fossil fuels, and even a giant and modernized country like Russia gets something like 60% of its income from its sale of its fossil fuels. Without that steady stream of income, those petrostates will crash economically. Their books won't balance. They might have mass unemployment. They will certainly have unrest. Whatever government's in power will be out of power, perhaps. Certainly the politicians involved will see it as their patriotic and fiduciary duty to burn that fossil fuel, sell it, and therefore it'll burn. It will be in effect, ironically, a fire sale. And if a bubble bursts and the value goes to nothing, that means there will be even more of a rush to the sale. So in the same time period that we need to stop burning fossil fuels and decarbonize as fast as possible, powerful countries like Russia, Canada, the United States, China, India, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, Venezuela, Mexico, Brazil, and Australia, crucially, highest per capita burn of coal on Earth is in Australia, which I'm sure is a fact down there that is being discussed. These petrostates will drag their feet in the process of decarbonization out of a sense of financial necessity. Another aspect of the global capitalist order that we live in, and what you might call the neoliberal capitalist order of the last 40 years, beginning with the Thatcher-Reagan counter-revolution of 1980 that ended the Keynesian period and began the kind of austerity neoliberal order that has been ruling the world the last 40 years, for better, but mostly for worse. In that system, capital goes to the highest rate of return. It's simply an algorithm, a very simple algorithm. It solves a lot of problems in terms of thinking, in terms of making value judgments. You simply locate the highest rate of return and invest there. And sucking billions of tons of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and putting it back into the ground is not going to be the highest rate of return. It's like building a giant sewage system. Swapping out already existing energy systems that are working at a profit and replacing them with other systems, that's not necessarily going to be the highest rate of return. So here, because capital, when there's a lot of private capital in this world, the estimates are made by your department and others. It's much more than, say, the reserves of the central banks, and more generated in kind of fictional ways, as Dick and his friends have taught me. It means that we can't escape the mass extinction event. So, okay, you say that, and this is the statement that comes out of what has been usefully termed capitalist realism. It used to be called cynical reason or instrumentality, but capitalist realism is a very good term for it. It's an evocation of Margaret Thatcher's "there is no alternative," that there's no way out, that we are doomed. This is what capitalist realism means now. So, okay, how does one then dodge the mass extinction event? One attempt is most certainly the Congress of Parties that signed the Paris Agreement in 2015. This is a UN organized body, and it's an attempt by the nation state system and by working by way of global capitalism to deal with a biospheric problem that affects everybody equally, but that the nation state system with its sovereignty is awkwardly or even poorly equipped to deal with. And the global capitalist system is in fact exacerbating, or one might even say, a huge part of the problem itself. So in this extremely unfortunate international order, the Congress of the Parties, and this was the 26th in Glasgow that just finished last month, is an attempt to deal on the international basis between the nation states with this system. Now, when one thinks of the United Nations as being the source of rescue, one can feel a bit of dismay, although it's very hard to run an alternative history without the United Nations to wonder what world history would be like. It does seem often toothless, but we don't want to let capitalist realism become cynical reason yet again. And here's the thing, it's what we've got. So this international attempt where 190 countries, and only a couple have stayed out of it, have gotten together and said, yes, we will do what we have to combat climate change, which means, in effect, to decarbonize as fast as possible. The existence of this process is itself a hopeful sign, and one of the places, by no means the only one, but one of the places where we can discuss the problem as an international community of nations and try to do something about it. It's a clearinghouse. It's a place where people make promises to each other to decarbonize, where countries make promises to each other to decarbonize. And in the Paris Agreement of 2015, a really significant moment in world history as a document and a move, I will say that it could, if it fails, it could become something like the League of Nations and significant in world history without being positively active. But it could do better than that, because we know what happens when efforts like this go wrong now. It has written into it a commitment to climate equity, which means simply that the rich nations pay more to help the poor countries. The rich nations having been the colonial nations, having been the carbon burn nations. It's a case of justice, and it's also a case of necessity, that the poor countries don't have the financial wherewithal, they don't have the capital to be able to pay for the necessary work to be done to shift them past the fossil fuel stage in often an immediate step from a complete lack of electrification, lack of toilets, lack of clean water, straight through to clean energy, clean water, and adequacy for human beings. This is the power of capital. It's owned substantially by the developed rich nation. It is their possession. It's a force in the world. It's a store of value, but also it is money in the bank that can be turned into human labor. And this is the thing that makes it crucial. And you can't, well, this is open to discussion, actually. I was going to say you can't generate it from nothing, but if it is indeed based on labor, you could say that it's an aspect of the problem that, if deployed right, can make human labor more powerful than it would be otherwise. So the Paris Agreement encodes in itself, and this was a mighty political battle in 2015, this commitment to climate equity. And so as a kind of an aside, as I proceed here, I want to say that I was at the COP26 meeting in Glasgow, and because the United Kingdom had leadership of the meeting had invited me, they gave me a red badge, which meant I was able to go anywhere. It was a Congress of Parties. I was a party to the Congress. It wouldn't have been appropriate for me to speak, and I didn't, but I was able to listen, go in and watch the delegates talk over the statement that they were going to bring out of COP26, which would be a required document that the Paris Agreement encoded in itself, that at each meeting of the COP process, each annual meeting, there was to be a ratcheting up on the part of promises. There was a promise to promise more within the Paris Agreement, a kind of ratchet system where you pull as hard as you can every year and maybe get one tooth of the ratchet pulled across, linked into place, hold on to that, and then the next year hope for more, and on it goes like that. It's in the structure of the COP system. I watched that with huge interest, and it was admirable, I have to say. Very serious lawyers and diplomats, more than 50% of them young women in their 30s, calmly, politely, and meticulously going over statements, sentences. It was not only like writing, it was writing, group composition, editing, revision. And so naturally, I loved it. It mattered to see such care being taken over words and over promises, because these sentences could turn into promises that turn into laws that change where capital goes. So there was consequence involved in these, and the attention to detail was astonishing. I watched a group of 30 very serious people talk for an hour as to whether the tables displaying their data were to be arranged in rows or in columns. And because my wife is a chemist and mathematician who works with tables all the time, I was able to follow that discussion with some interest. I understood that it was not frivolous, that it mattered. And this was extremely interesting to watch. And as I say, if people kept their promises, and if we had, say, 40 years, then this process could do the job. And it's trying, but there are a couple of problems. The whole Congress of the Party was set up from the very beginning as to be by true consensus, unusual in the UN. In the General Assembly, usually a majority of vote will win. To have 190 nations, all of them agree completely, is a high bar and it creates part of the slowness and the cautiousness of going forward, because everybody has to agree to whatever gets said. This is a tough requirement. And we saw at the end of Glasgow, I hope, famous example. The document for this year was going to say, we will phase out coal. And at the last minute, because of objections from China and India, it was changed to, we will phase down coal. So these kinds of attentions to words are, as admirable as they are subject to the consensus problem that everybody has to agree, or the statement won't be approved by all. So in short, COP is going to be too slow. We have about a decade to decarbonize really rapidly. And you can see already the discrepancy between how quickly we are decarbonizing and how quickly we are promising each other we will decarbonize, and how quickly we actually are decarbonizing. And it seems inevitable that through the course of the decade, that discrepancy will grow unless something other than COP process itself is done. And here we come back to the idea of a new political economy. So the COP system is just one venue. It's it requires every 5 years a global stock take to see where we are in terms of the numbers of keeping to our promises in that system. But it itself is a global stock taking, a place where we can, a clearinghouse where we can all gather and talk about what we've done, and we can promise to promise more. Already we are seeing, this is another big problem with COP. It is simply, there is no sheriff, there is no jail, there is no judge. It's just promises. And some political leaders back home will send delegates to the COP system making promises that they know very well that they themselves will not have to keep, because they've kicked them down the can to later times when they won't be in power anymore. And already the rich countries are breaking their promises. There was a promise to give $100 billion to the developing countries. This is part of the climate equity thing. It didn't happen. There was, out of that 100 billion, 80 billion was suddenly turned into debt relief only. In other words, it wasn't new money to be spent on adaptation or mitigation. It was simply forgiveness of debts on money that had already been spent. They got down to $20 billion that got transferred from the developed world to the developing world in the time that had been promised. Not 100, but 20 billion. And the budget for New York City's annual sewage treatment is $15 billion. So you can see that $20 billion per year is next to nothing compared to the problem involved. And it was noticeable that the developing nations, what at the UNN is sometimes called the G77, but in any case, all the developing nations, the low-lying island nations, the nations in the tropics, and et cetera, that they were angry and disappointed. and demanding that more be done, and seeing that in the actions and words, polite but implacable on the part of the representatives for the developed nations, that it wasn't going to be done. Not enough was going to be done. The rich nations were going to be stingy across the board and as a united front as against the developing nations. This was, even despite the politeness and the diplomatic quiet of the negotiating sessions at COP, underneath that surface was a very serious anger and despair, because no one gives their money away. This is, there might be individuals rich enough that they give away some of their money as charity, although there are analysts of the whole charity and foundation system that declare that it's really just a tax dodge, and that that money is never given away in any way substantial enough to threaten the ultimate wealth and power of those giving it. But it seems to me that it's obvious, and I very much appreciate Lynn mentioning the kind of realist view of, in my novels, of how people act, and I would not claim any particular insight into that. And besides which, this is pretty obvious. People don't generally give their money away. So, having somewhat painted myself into a corner here, I want to point out that this is a corner that the world is painted into, not just me in my talk. And I come to something that is mentioned in my Ministry for the Future, my novel, that is really what got me invited to Glasgow, to tell you the truth, and has been taken up in that community as a vision of what could be if things were to go well, that the effort made by the worldwide community, if exerted in full and enthusiastically over the next 3 decades, we could get to a good place. Part of this had to do specifically with political economy, in the sense of what I called a carbon coin. It was a notion that the central banks, with creating fiat money in a way similar to quantitative easing. So we saw quantitative easing in 2008 and in 2020 with the pandemic, central banks backed by governments and armies, making up new money that got spent to keep the economy going, keep people from falling into unemployment and hunger. That this quantitative easing, if it was directed specifically to decarbonization projects, then it could be called carbon quantitative easing, CQE, and a carbon coin. There's various versions of it. If you were to suck 100 tons of carbon out of the atmosphere, you would be given one carbon coin. A carbon coin would be backed by a lot of central banks, and it would float on the currency exchange markets with the rest of the currencies. And because of the backing of the central banks and maybe some long-term bonds that could be offered with a very good return, not too good, but enough to be tempting to make, so that you could go long on civilization rather than shorting it, that all these combined would create a kind of a financial incentive to invest in decarbonization and also get paid for it, so that rather than losing money by doing the virtuous thing and helping the generations to come, you would make money by doing these things. So after I finished ministry, I found out that there was a organization called the Network for Greening the Financial System. It's somewhat the idea of Mark Carney, but in it, who of the Bank of England, and he was prominent at Glasgow as well. The 89 of the central banks have gathered together to talk about how to green the financial system using monetary means and staying within their purview as central banks, but nevertheless doing things that central banks are already allowed to do, that would mean that money would be channelized towards decarbonizing work without too explicitly altering the already existing methods and balance of forces in the governments of the world. Whether this would be enough is an open question, but it's extremely encouraging that they're talking about this. You don't want this to be an idea in a science fiction novel. You want this to be policies of nations. And indeed, there's also an organization called the G-Feds, which might be even more important, the Federal Reserve Banks, the central banks of the G20, of the G7. Some people talk about the G2 being the US and China, that if these central banks get interested in making money a green force, that this is one of the ways forward. I want to suggest, I'll come back to this later, that this is simply a form of Keynesianism, and that's not a bad thing. After the neoliberal period, a return to Keynes, with an acknowledgement that governments at certain points need to intervene hugely in the economic system and guide the markets, take over the markets, direct the markets towards targeted ends, is a necessary aspect and a political economy that is distinct from what we've been living in for the last 40 years. So it's not just monetary theory that'll do it either. There is no one solution, and any seizing of one solution as being, oh, good, now we're going to be okay, that's always an improper response. But it is a hopeful sign that it's being looked at this angle. Regulation by governments of what can be done and what can't. Legislation where money is not just made up by the central banks, but also demanded to be made up by the legislative actions of the governments of the world. Also carbon taxes, putting a price on carbon, as everybody is begging who knows about this, that the social cost of carbon, the true cost of burning carbon, that if these were paid, then suddenly it would not be profitable to burn fossil fuels anymore for anyone, and that would help a lot. But to return to this carbon quantitative easing, if $4 trillion a year, and this is a kind, not just a guess on my part, but an estimate by people who have looked at the necessity of how quickly we have to decarbonize in infrastructural terms, what would that mean? $4 trillion a year paid to workers to rapidly decarbonize our civilization, that is pretty close to a full employment program. It seems to me that at that point you have got a kind of public works, a system that where the fear of unemployment going away would put enormous pressure on corporations to pay adequacy. If the people doing this work were getting paid adequately for their life needs, if they had Social Security as well, then they might flock to these jobs, and then private corporations would have to equal that in order to gain workers at all. And suddenly we might have a floor of social adequacy, as the welfare states often not only tried but succeeded in creating, a floor that has gone away in the neoliberal order by and large, so that everybody's in the precariat and feels it. This kind of effort to rapidly decarbonize could mitigate that. A lot of this, by the way, sounds quite similar to what I've been reading of modern monetary theory, which has some Australian roots, but is now worldwide and is popular in New York University, where some of Dick Bryan's associates worked. I say modern monetary theory is simply Keynesianism redux with an emphasis on full employment and an emphasis on the abilities of government to go into debt without ramifications in terms of destabilizing social trust in money by way of inflation or deflation. Now, these are speculative statements to a certain extent, but the history of the last 100 years can be trolled for evidence one way or another. It's very confusing. It's amazing how little can be drawn from all that. And indeed, one can draw preferentially to make any case that you really want. But I think it's quite clear that we have, in fact, very often done stimulus spending by way of governments, never drawn that money back in, and not seen the value of money go crazy. So we will be in a long-term unconstrained experiment in how much money can be generated by the central banks without crashing the system and making the situation better. Now, let me come back to this idea of a carbon coin. You draw carbon down, you get paid for it. What if you have carbon that you don't burn? Should you get paid for that? That brings us back to the petrostates. And here's something that I just saw getting discussed in Glasgow, because I was bringing it up myself quite often, and it was getting discussed as an idea. The petrostates are going to have to be paid off. If they were used to, and they were receiving $100 billion a year for the fossil fuels that they were burning, and that gets cut off, if 70% of their national income were to get cut off, it would be disaster for them. So this, at first glance, sounds like it contradicts several of the laws of economics, such as they are. It sounds like you would be paying a blackmailer or an extortionist, like pay me or I'll blow up the world, that kind of talk. On the other hand, we have all used fossil fuels our entire lives. They've kept us alive. They've been part of our education, our food, our transport. We are a fossil fuel civilization. So too much holier than thou moralism about the petrostates is really out of place. And I suppose that in Australia that might be appreciated, that we needed those fossil fuels, or at least they were massively implicated in the Great Acceleration and the rise out of poverty of billions of people. Now those nations are stuck holding stranded assets. They can't burn that stuff for the sake of everyone, including themselves. Very important to remember. But they also don't have an economic system that can sustain the loss of that income. They need to get paid. So here you have a really tricky situation that will require all the central banks and international accommodations that maybe COP will be good at negotiating. It's hard to say. Once again, nobody likes to give away their money. But on the other hand, if this is new money, it didn't exist in the first place until it was made. So maybe people aren't as unwilling to give away money that they didn't even have to the moment that they gave it away. And here's where the power of capital comes through. The developed nations could do that. The developing nations, if they tried it, would simply create hyperinflation and the crash of their economy. You can also talk about, as they do in finance, you can talk about haircuts. The petrostates will have to take a haircut. You can talk about amortizing things, that if they were going to get paid this stupendous amount of trillions of dollars for their fossil fuels over the next century, that they need to get paid out over that time. And maybe it will get discounted. Maybe there will be entailments on the payments to them that will represent a challenge to their sovereignty and make people squeak and moan. On the other hand, that money needs to be paid for decarbonization, and the various fossil fuel companies like oil companies could push carbon dioxide back into the earth with the same infrastructural technology as they sucked it out in the first place. So once again, also, this does represent this creation of carbon coins to be paid to the petrostates in some way or other. Compensation is another kind of full employment plan, because it will end up being human work to make all these things. I'm close to the end here, and I want to come back briefly again to talk about John Maynard Keynes. As a lifelong American leftist, the idea of putting forth John Maynard Keynes as the great salvation of modern civilization seems a little bit, shall I say, timid. But after 40 years of neoliberalism, a recent biography of Keynes called The Price of Peace by Zachary Carter, quite a good biography because it isn't just of Keynes, but of Keynesianism, reminds us that when he put forth suggestions for financial arrangements after World War I at Versailles, he was ignored, and we got the 20s, the 30s, and World War II. When he managed to insinuate himself into the brain trust for FDR in the Great Depression and was listened to, the coping with the Depression was good. And at Bretton Woods, in the reconstitution of the world order after World War II, had wrecked everything. If his suggestions had been listened to and attended to for creating a kind of a balance of trade credits between rich nations and poor, that was a precursor to climate equity, but it wasn't listened to in its time. So it's instructive, particularly, I think, in a Department of Political Economy to reckon on using the tools that have been used before to think about how we can get through and dodge this mass extinction event. If you equate it to a struggle as mighty as World War II, then it's obvious that the government should seize the economy and do everything necessary to survive. A lot of people aren't going to see it, because a war where people are actually bombing your city, it's very obvious. You need to organize to resist that and try to survive. When it's these weather events, well, Australia burned, California burned, the floods. At some point, I think an equivalent feeling of desperation might grow to the point where we have to acknowledge that the market is a fool. The market is a simple algorithm for profit and shareholder value that does not take into account the biospheric realities. It is a Ponzi scheme. It is inadequate to the dangers that we're in. It needs to be guided, let's put it that way. I'm not saying it needs to be abolished. We got to use the tools that we have, and private capital can be a mighty force for the good if it's shoved in that direction. So again, this is Keynes. He did not advocate for socialism or for the end of private industry. He merely suggested that in emergencies, in times of emergency, things have to be organized to do the necessary. So I'll end with this final thought. Profit is an index. Shareholder value is an index. In other words, it's made up from a whole bunch of calculations to make a single number that supposedly stands for something. Here's where departments of economics, as well as departments of political economy, might serve a very useful purpose. What would be the proper index? What would be the biospheric measure of a good human action in economic terms? And so there's a spot for what would be an academic exercise in the purest terms that could also be shifted into the world, hopefully in the same way that Keynes managed, into the political economy of countries. In other words, how do we quantify all these things? How should the petrostates be paid for? How can we make climate equity real in monetary terms as well as human action in the world? These are questions that legislators, political representatives, will not be capable of inventing and thinking of on their own. They will seize the tools given them by the intellectual community surrounding them. So problems of rhetoric, of persuasion, I mean to say, of getting your story across and getting the information and the tools, plausible tools in the right hands for the job at hand, are part of the process for universities. And with that, I have hit my mark, and I'm going to stop and talk with Dick. Thank you very much.
Hi, Stan, and hi, everyone. Thanks, Stan, for a fabulous talk. I want to start by telling you I don't understand what's going on in the world of economic policy, social policy, climate policy. I don't understand why a guy who writes science fiction novels gets invited to COP26, gets asked to write long essays for the world's preeminent financial newspaper, the Financial Times, why a science fiction writer gets invited to give this talk, or indeed why a Murdoch-owned news outlet, Sky News, has expressed an enthusiasm to broadcast this very lecture. So what do you think it is? What's happening in the world that sees an appetite for the narrative form and fiction in particular as an important contribution to these critical policy areas?
Well, thanks for that. And I gotta say immediately, it's partly because I am writing novels that have been assisted by my conversations with you, with Bob Meister at UC Santa Cruz, with Randy Martin, with a crowd of people that was called Rethinking Capitalism that met at UC Santa Cruz, which is where Dick and I met in maybe 2010. And the education from those people, and also from books like Government by Debt by Lazzarato, or The Ascent of Finance by Vogel. My reading has been directed by these people, and slowly but surely I've assembled an education in political economy that is still at an English major's level of understanding. But a couple more things have happened. In the 21st century, there's a sense of the great acceleration running out of hand to the point where everybody is feeling like they're living in a science fiction novel, a maybe dystopian, but in any case, techno crazy science fiction novel that has to do with social media. If your internet goes down, you feel like your head's been chopped in half. We're all cyborgs. We're all experiencing time acceleration. We're in a science fiction novel. And so there's a sense of familiarity there. And the pandemic has massively increased that sense that we're in a world community, that we're in a moment of history, that history's still being made, and that science fiction has a way of telling it that the ordinary literary fiction is completely lost at sea, a kind of a remnant from the 1950s that no longer speaks to where we are. On the other hand, fiction has traditionally been the place where we put together the social and understand what life means. So you've got the individual consciousness, and that's your main character, and the rest of the characters. How do individuals interact with other individuals? Then also, how does the individual interact with their society? This would be the realist novel of, say, Balzac or George Eliot, Joseph Conrad, that era. And then science fiction adds this, the relationship between people and planet. It's a planetary fiction. So all these things combined, and I would say that over the period of since the year 2000, I've been writing continuously about these issues and with various success, which is to say that sometimes not so much. It was hard writing about Washington, D.C. bureaucracies against all these issues, but something came together in the Ministry for the Future that makes it different and has put me in a different position vis-a-vis the world intellectual community. People would like to think that we could get through the next 30 years without a mass extinction event. What would that look like? How could it happen? There aren't many novels that try to tell that story. So this is really, I think, what has happened and what got me invited to COP26. I was stunned, truly, at how many people there had read that book already. And for them, it was a vision of hope that their flailing slow motion efforts might actually add up to something good in the end.
Yeah, it's an interesting statement that it starts to be read as a policy document rather than as a projection into the future. But yeah. I guess, if you spoke to someone in 2005 and told them what was going to happen in the next 15 years, that there'd be a financial crisis, quantitative easing, invention of Bitcoin, pandemic, companies getting bailed out by states to stay profitable, everyone would have said, "You're making it up. It's fiction." So you're in the reality zone, really, even though it is a form of science fiction.
Yes.
Yeah. It's interesting. In mainstream economics, the narrative form is now being recognised. Robert Schiller wrote a book called Narrative Economics, but it's all about narrative as distortion. You know, it's a behavioural economics book. So really, it's the ultimate denial of the narrative form, really, because it's saying it stops people understanding. So I just want to push on a little bit in this direction, and sort of in recognition that there is a broadcaster who was keen to or is keen to put this lecture to air. We know that out there's a lot of fake science and a lot of fake news, and it's being peddled about climate change, and it's being peddled about vaccination for the anti-vaxxers. And a lot of this is being broadcast in social media, but also certainly in Australia. I know in the US it's quite prevalent on pay-view and subscription stations like Sky. So I want to ask a slightly rude question, but as a way of eliciting some interesting information. How is what you do different from fake science? How is what you do as a science fiction writer? Is it just that you're the progressive version and they're the conservative reactionary version? Or do you actually think you operate with a different analytical method from fake science?
I would say that the phrase fake science is a kind of an attack phrase that doesn't have a correlate in the real world. It's either science or it's not. You can't fake it. It's the science itself is the name for a social process that has to do with practices in the real world. You can maybe there's pretend, or maybe that's what you mean. You can say, well, but many of these attacks on scientific realities don't even put forth a scientific counter narrative. They merely cast doubt. So like the phrase green fascism or various kinds of attack terms, I would reject the term outright as being non-existent. There's either science or there's not. And science is a methodology that is institutionalized across the board by way of experimentation, repetition, fitting in with a paradigm, peer review, and all of the various aspects that make it what we call science are unfakeable. Although they can be gamed, they can be pushed, they can be bought. So it's a contested space. But in terms of telling stories, I would say, yes, I'm telling a story. The interesting thing to do would then be to look at the tropes called rhetoric. Rhetoric is the ancient Greek art of persuasion. And you use various methods to make the story that you are telling persuasive to listeners. So in Ministry for the Future, the methodology would include using all kinds of different forms, taking all kinds of different speaker positions, talking explicitly about ideology and what it is, talking explicitly about economics, so that as a novel, one of the things a novel can do is include little nonfiction segments along with discussing the lives of its characters. This happens fairly frequently in certain kinds of novels, and certainly Ministry is one of them. You lay all your cards on the table and invite the reader to evaluate it as such. Here's where I stand, here's where the novel stands, here's what it's saying, here's what could happen if we did things right. Can you deny it? No, you can't. So it's an attempt to make a case as in a debating society. Now, who judges the debate is interesting. There is no God judging us, unfortunately, and it's not like the Oxford Debating Society where you lay your case out, the other side lays their case out, and a so-called impartial jury looks at the case as a debating case and chooses who won the debate in formal terms, irrespective of the content. That doesn't happen in the world at large. You're one voice in the multitude, and one of the things about social media is the roar effect, in that any possible thing that could be said is being said. So then you have to sort it out, and that's ideology. The imaginary relationship to the real situation, This is Althusser. It's very important. It's one of the very first chapters of Ministry to talk about this explicitly. We all have an imaginary relationship to the real situation. The real situation is unknowable to any individual. It's too big. It's too variable. There's too much of it. So you have a sorting system, which is your ideology that says this is important, this isn't, this fits with what I believed before, this doesn't. That imaginary relationship, that story that you tell yourself, how baked in is it? How concrete is it? How brittle and immovable is it? Some people will never change. College students are making theirs up as they study. So, and some people are more malleable than others in their ability to change their ideology based on new information. You speak to those people when you write a novel, and you speak to people who love to read novels. And that's really only people you can speak to. They have to actually pick it up and invest an enormous amount of time and imaginative energy to be inside the novel. To read it is a generous gift to the book itself. And having made that investment, sometimes you do get persuaded by the book. You say, oh yeah, that could happen. If a better world could happen, then we should make it. This is the logical hope that I have.
Yeah, no, look, that makes sense. I mean, the answer I was sort of expecting you to include in that was some reference to the fact that you historicize in the Frederick Jameson sense. When you write fiction, you write social relations. It's not just science, pure and simple. And those people I'm referring to as the fake science, they don't historicize. They don't engage social relations. The only social relations they engage are conspiracies. So in a sense, there's an idealism to a theology to theirs and a materiality to yours. Now we're running short on time, but I just want to pose to you a very short question about the carbon coin, because I think for me in the Ministry for the Future, this issuance and the debate about the carbon coin, not its technical content, but the process by which central banks get persuaded to issue. This is, for me, the inspiring politics of this book, because essentially what you're saying is the ministry says to all the central banks, if you don't issue it, we will set up a network of climate activists and they will issue it themselves. It's a challenge to the state's capacity, the central bank's capacity to be the sole issuer of money. I'm wondering, does that sort of argument about distributed crypto-based modes of organisation, does that get any resonance in your circuit around the climate change policy area, or are people just more interested in the substance of the carbon coin?
Well, I must say that in Glasgow, I met groups of people who were trying to theorize various kinds of cryptocurrencies or digital currencies or non-fungible tokens that would allow people to invest directly in wild animals or in forests. These were two specific plans where you could maybe bypass the legislatures and the central banks and say, my money I'm putting behind these efforts in a distributed ledger. And all of them have had to fight the horrible reputation that Bitcoin has given to the possibilities of digital currencies and distributed ledgers, because Bitcoin is seen, I think rightly, as a speculative bubble and as a horrid burn of carbon of people trying to make money from nothing by essentially running their engines all night long in order to make less money than keeping the engine off would. And in essence, like tulips in the 17th century, a speculative bubble that could burst at any moment. That has delegitimated or caused huge doubts to be caused towards the technology of blockchain itself. That needs to be, the smoke has to clear, the distinctions have to be made between Bitcoin and these other possibilities. But I am surprised and was interested to see that I would say dozens of people had come to Glasgow to talk about this plan. and I'll have to share the names with you on the side of some of them. They were interesting people. I myself am trailing this whole discussion with a certain amount of incomprehension. So I'm just reporting what I've heard.
Sure. Look, our time is about to expire, but I just want to say thank you for raising the issue in this way, because I think in the world of heterodox economics and political economy, there's a certain skepticism about the domain of crypto, that finance is seen as unproductive and speculative, and crypto economics is just thought to be a Hayekian libertarian domain. And I think what you've done is show the possibility that it can be an organising tool for an activist politics, and that's an inspirational contribution. So I'm going to leave it there, Stan. Thank you so much for our little conversation, and I'll pass back to Lynn, who will introduce our student questions.
Okay, thanks for everything, Dick, including huge help on this book, and we'll be talking soon.
Pleasure. Thanks, Stan.
Yep.
Bye.
Yep.
Now we'll go to our student panel to ask Stan questions, and we'll start with Anna.
Hello, Stan. Lovely to be here, and thank you for that talk. It's really interesting. I'll begin very quickly by saying that I'm coming to you today from the Gadigal land of the Eora people. And I have a question that sort of departs from the crypto stuff and asks a little bit more about history from below, I guess. So I'm interested in how engaged you may have been or may not have been with the Indigenous, ecological, and feminist critiques of orthodox Marxist thought. So people like Glenn Coulthard from Canada, John Bellamy Foster and Jason Moore from Ecological Marxism, Ariel Salar, Vandana Shiva. I think Vandana Shiva was maybe quoted in the Ministry for the Future. I'm not sure, but I'm really interested in how you may have come across these sorts of arguments and how they intersect with what appears to be like quite a classical development of the productive forces argument that really lies at the basis, it seems, of a lot of your work. Yeah, hopefully that's a reasonable question to answer in a short space of time.
Yes, thank you. I will do my best. It's been a huge part of my education as a science fiction writer from my youth on in feminism. And this is because of feminist science fiction writers, not just the big three, Ursula Le Guin, Joanna Russ, James Tiptree Jr., who was Alice Sheldon, and now a new addition to the canon, Octavia Butler, but also at least 20 feminist science fiction writers of my generation and younger who have informed the entire sense of the future as being a space where feminist utopian imaginaries can flourish and teach us how to act better now. In terms of theory, John Bellamy Foster, very important to me, and also very much Nancy Fraser. Nancy Fraser is someone who writes about social reproduction as being humans helping other humans, mutual aid in a kind of Kropotkin sense. It always happens, substantially done by women and substantially unpaid, and that if it were not for this social reproduction, as she calls it, but mutual aid is a good word, and it's an affect state too, that you do what you need to care for the people around you, young, old, disabled, and just everybody, that this is parasitically sucked on by capitalism, that there would be no profit without it parasiting on social reproduction, as on the biosphere, as on biospheric reproduction. But amongst humans, it's had a terrible tearing force. It's one of the bad things of being poor, of being in the precariat, of being part of the capitalist machinery where nothing matters but money, where nothing matters but what has got a cost and a price and a wage put on it. So the basic Marxist critique of capitalism needed to be extended in those directions, and it has been. And so then what to do about it? This is where feminist science fiction, especially Joanna Russ, but Le Guin also, has been really helpful to me. And I've tried from the Mars trilogy on to represent that in stories without flagging it too much, because really it seems to me that when men begin to flag the incredible virtue of their feminism, that something's gone wrong there, and a circle has been drawn back to the male predominance in theory that I don't want to do. And it's nice when you're a novelist, you can simply stay behind the stage and your women characters can speak and act in the world, do what they do. And I've done that all along in my novels, and I have great models around me to draw on in terms of characters for these novels. So between theory, practice, and the huge capacity of the novel, I've tried to take into account that aspect of things. And the indigenous, now that's a kind of new problematic for me, but I wrote Shaman in 2012, thinking about the Paleolithic, and all indigenous cultures resembled each other because they all came out of Africa 100,000 years ago, and shamanic cultures have long lives. And I'm not saying that they're all the same, but they come from the same source. And indigeneity has ancient roots everywhere. That's gotten so interesting that I've become interested in my own local issues with I'm speaking from Patwin land. This is the village of Putatoy, but I'm very interested in the High Sierras, where I spent a lot of time, where it was Paiute country. So these are new issues for me that I hope to pursue. And thank you.
Thank you. That was really interesting. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Anna. Now we'll go to Sam. And Sam and the others, I'm just mindful of time. Thanks.
Hi, Stan. Thanks for your talk. I'd also like to acknowledge that I am calling in from Gadigal country. My question is just going to be quickly prefaced by a very short story you wrote for this book, which accompanied an artwork that was on display a couple of years ago, that theorized what it would look like if all humans moved into one city. And as part of your short story, a group of explorers go out to an unknown location outside the city and have to navigate back. And as part of it, there was some explicit discussions of like material technologies, agricultural drones, blimps or aircraft, but there were sort of some undercurrents of social technologies. So as part of it, people were traveling slowly. They were on a 1-month holiday, which assumes, that there's people have the option to do that. So I was wondering how you use social technologies and material technologies to forecast what your stories will be, what the process literarily is for that.
Well, sure. Thank you for that. This project by Liam Young, I think was on display in Melbourne. It put all humans in one city, and they didn't specify where, but maybe the Amazon or the steppes of Asia, and then the rest of the world left to the animals. It's a strange and beautiful utopian vision. And because young humans tend to move to the cities from rural areas and from small towns, it seems to follow a natural urge that something about the urban and the technological sublime has caught people. And you got more jobs, but you have more excitement. You have more other young people in cities, and there's something attractive about cities. Now, I think that this is a dialectic, and that you would need to have a sense of the larger world. And I myself would love my month per year, and it's about what I get as a small town dweller in the High Sierra as my wilderness. So I wrote it from that perspective. It's a fun notion, I think, to say you're dropped somewhere on Earth, you have to figure out where you are and try to get home before you run out of food. But also, if you get to the local highest peak, there's a blimp there waiting for you to float on home. A kind of more playful than usual thought experiment in the utopian imaginary. And as for social technologies, yes, these are Raymond Williams' structure of feeling, that a social group comes together with a general intellect, as Marx put it, and a structure of feeling, as Raymond Williams put it, that seems like common sense, or it seems like the way things are and might be forever, but it changes every 5 years or so. these changes, could they be prompted by the stories that we tell each other about how it would be good to live? Well, this is my hope, that utopian science fiction can prompt in the mind the sense that there could be future worlds we could make together that would be better than this one that we're in right now. So it's always seemed to me that science fiction that focuses on the machinery is making a mistake. The machinery is the result of our desires and our thoughts about what would be nice to be able to do. And that too has informed my fiction throughout.
Thanks, Dan. Now we'll go to Leah.
Thank you, Stan. I'm going to try and be brief, but I guess you were invited to COP26 sort of as someone who has influenced some of the policy makers there, and who has sort of brought these ideas into the central stage. But I'm wondering if your experience, I'm pretty sure it's the first time you've attended this year, if that taught you anything different, or if you felt like there were things you might have said in Ministry to the Future that you had a rethink on.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm still sorting that out. A lot of things struck me as familiar, and I was thinking, but wait, that's because I've been to so many damn science fiction conventions. And COP was like a giant trade show. It was like the negotiations were special and interesting and different. The rest of it was like a trade show, a science fiction convention, a circus, a mass demonstration. I marched with the Glaswegian marchers on the first day of marches, and 10,000 people stood on a bridge and watched families pass. I thought to myself, there's a scene in Ministry for the Future that ought to be written that wasn't, where it wasn't a violent demonstration of resistance, but a peaceful demonstration of hope. Because families were taking their kids out of preschools and ordinary schools. It was a giant holiday in Glasgow that Friday. I stood on a bridge with Bill McKibben, and I can't tell you how many people recognized him and came over to thank him. It was like being with the rock star of the environmental movement, and some even recognized me. It was rather astonishing. But the thing is, the site was intensely militarized. The UK was thinking perhaps Seattle 1999, some violent scene. So they had possibly 50,000 police and military on site. They had helicopters overhead. They had military boats and Zodiacs on the River Clyde, and fences with barbed wire at the top or spikes pointing outward to keep you from getting into the blue zone. It was amazing how militarized the site was in a defensive sense. And those marchers just marched by it, wandered through with hilarious signs, the wrong Amazon is burning, unfuck the world, please. These were Scottish in origin. They'd come from all over Scotland, including Dunbar, the home of John Muir, which I had visited and seen their preparations, sewn quilts, not a single arrest that day. And so there should be the sense that mass demonstrations can push the political leadership to tell the negotiators inside COP to do better. So it wasn't the negotiators that the marchers were protesting against. It was in protest to the political leadership of the world to act faster. This was not in Ministry for the Future because I wrote it in 2019. I hadn't seen a COP. It was also a much darker time. Trump was president, and we hadn't yet had the pandemic to slap us in the face and wake us up to reality. There are ways in which my book has been absolutely superseded by the last 2 years, and in particular, its timeline is totally off. Things are going to happen way faster than I wrote in my book, and this is really a good thing. So thank you.
Great, thank you.
I should mention, by the way, that Australian Delton Chen wrote one of the original papers on the carbon coin, and his work on it since has been influential in the world. So a thank you to Delton Chen of Australia for that originary work, which you can find online as a Springer Verlag paper that has risk in the title.
Thanks, Leah. And now we'll go to our final question from our student panel from Swapnik.
Hi, Stan. Thanks so much for your talk today. It seems like in the world that we've been discussing and what you outline, central banks go from having, a price stability mandate to almost having a civilizational mandate. Do you think that the turn to central banking is something to do with the failure of politics as it exists, or do you think there's something unique in central banks that make them, a worthy tool for dealing with the climate crisis and dealing with the civilizational challenges that we have?
This is a really good question, because it puts the finger on the fact that really it's the legislatures that set the parameters on what central banks can do. And it's a joke in my novel that in order to keep prices stabilized, the central banks have to therefore consider saving civilization, because if they don't save civilization, then their money's likely to go haywire. So this is obviously backwards, but funny, because central banks are given very narrow tasks, but they do have the ability to do quantitative easing, and money does speak in the world. Something that comes to me from your question: every time a bank issues a loan to somebody, to a client, and they have only 3% of the value of their loans in assets in that bank, is it not the case, therefore, that the private banks are also quantitatively easing all the time, in that they're making loans that they could not actually back with real money? And yet, once they make that loan, that client certainly considers it real money when the check comes, and they bank it and they begin to pay for real work in the real world. So central banks, I mean, China's got the largest amount of reserves. The central bank has maybe $4 trillion. Private capital might have ungodly amounts if you were to tot it up. This is something for an economics department to do. How much is out there in private bank loans that isn't backed by reserves? Mark Carney said that he had rallied banks that had $130 trillion in assets that were all promising to do green work, green investing. Not every one of their investments, that $130 trillion was notional and laughed at. On the other hand, it indicates how much is out there. So yes, if the political representatives of the citizens of the world are bought by fossil fuels and also the finance industry, and their votes and their legislation is skewed towards the good of fossil fuels and the finance industry, as opposed to the good of the biosphere and of ordinary citizens that voted them in, something's wrong there. Could it be finessed by the central banks deciding that in order to keep money stable, they have to save the world? It's, in a way, what your question does is reveal that Ministry for the Future, in some ways, this whole angle is a kind of a giant joke, or an illustration of how badly democracy and ordinary government is working, that it hasn't already seized finance in order to deliberately do these things by legislation. And that would be the preferred result. The central bank ploy is a kind of a almost a finger in the dike. It's not. It's trying to have the tail wag the dog. I'm flailing for an image. It's not the strongest approach. The strongest approach would be to assemble a working political majority to make your legislatures do the right thing. Australia's got an obvious case. Could you actually get a working majority, get in a government that will immediately stop burning coal, selling coal, and hope for compensation for that, and pay their way out of it? Australia's strong enough economy to maybe do it. So can those working political majorities worldwide be assembled to do the work? And if not, the technocrats, like my Mary Murphy, like the Ministry for the Future, they're going to be looking for whatever little leverage they can get in a larger world system. So I want to thank you for that, because it allows me to explain the kind of weirdness of my plot. But you tell the story that you can imagine.
Thanks, Swapnik. And thanks to all our student panel. And thanks, of course, to Stan. Before concluding today's event, I would like to thank our speaker and our other participants. So on behalf of the Department of Political Economy, thank you, Stan, and of course, Dick, Anna, Sam, Leah, and Swapnik for fabulous questions and fabulous answers from Stan. Stan, you've articulated today and elsewhere, the next decade will be quite a pivotal period in our history. The biosphere, as you've written elsewhere, is our home, our one and only home. And you've explained, I think, really well, we've got to change our relationship with our home, a more balanced relationship, a relationship that will require a transformation, multiple actions, multiple changes, economic, social, economic, technological, and not one or two, but multiple changes and actions on our part, and a commitment, very strong commitment to climate equity and about confronting that power of capital. You've given us what we would call a quite robust political economy analysis, historicising, nice critical thoughts about social reality, MMT, we're not all fans, despite the Australian origins, MMT, about the need for policies and what your narrative has imagined, all those multiple changes that need to occur, and to confront those big questions and to have an arsenal of plausible tools and dealing with those petrostates and dealing with those carbon coins. So, in conclusion, I just want to say thank you, Kim Stanley Robinson, for what has indeed been a very, very insightful, engaging and memorable 14th Wheelwright annual lecture. And I do hope that one day you may include us on your travels and meet us in person in Australia. Thank you very much to everyone.